In today's episode of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, we feature Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. She's a renowned international speaker, professor, and author with a diverse portfolio of books on topics from theology to literature, with a particular focus on 18th century British literature. Despite recent notable disagreements with the Southern Baptist Convention, her faith remains unwavering. Her passion for words and profound reverence for the Word of God are central to her life. During the discussion, she explores the impact of Christian worldviews on historical events, including the abolition movement and the cause of animal safety. Tune in for a conversation with Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor that promises to enlighten and inspire. Here's your host, Melvin E. Edwards.
Thank you for that introduction. Dr. Pryor, I know you're very busy, so I'm honored that you take the time out to join me today.
I'm honored to be with you.
Thanks. So you're my third straight guest who has a PhD. So I have smart guests and listeners, and I feel like I need to raise my IQ game today. So I'm not going to say y'all, all y'all, or Dallas Cowboys.
Okay.
That's a little dig at the Cowboys fans. So before we get into business, I first want to say that I'm thankful that your mom recently completed her cancer radiation.
Thank you.
And I
Thank
just
you.
want to find out how she's doing.
Yeah, she's really doing well. The radiation was entirely preventative because they believe the surgery she had removed all the cancer. But radiation takes its toll, and she's 88. So she's been resting a lot and is recovering. But we're really very thankful overall.
Oh, good. Good to hear that. So I know you've been traveling a lot this month. So where in the world is Karen Pryor today?
I am recording this podcast from my home in Central Virginia, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Nice. My son lives in Virginia. He lives in Northern Virginia.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm a country girl, so Northern Virginia is like a different state.
It's definitely different from Central and Southern Virginia. All right. So considering current culture, how difficult is it these days to be named Karen?
Oh, you start right in with the with the tough question. It's interesting. I mean, I don't take anything personally, and I think I have a good sense of humor. I think, but I always really liked my name. I thought it was a great name. I should have known things were going to get downhill when about 20 years ago. Even before the current, meme of the name, one of my students had an old car, and she said she named it Karen. And I said, "Why did you name it Karen?" And she said, "Well, it's a car from the 80s. So, Karen is an 80s name." And that was the first I ever thought about my name being old and going the way of Bertha and Beulah. But now it's even worse. But it's, there are people whose names have more problems, so I won't complain.
Yeah, when your name is Melvin, you sort of develop thick skin pretty early on.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I was
All right,
thinking more of John.
All right, all the Johns out there, no offense. All right, so your expertise is 18th century British literature. So I was thinking that's Daniel Defoe, who's known to Robinson
Yes.
Crusoe, and Jonathan Swift, satire, A Modest Proposal, which is still very misunderstood even today. And he also wrote Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
So why did you choose to zero in on that era and region of human intellect?
That is such a good question, and there are a couple of answers. When I was an English major in undergraduate college, I did sort of decide at that point that I preferred British literature over American. Probably that happened the day that I was assigned to read Moby Dick in American literature, and I was like, no, we're going to do British lit. And then when I went into my PhD program, I was taking a lot of British literature courses in different eras across the centuries, and I think the real answer is simply that it was my 18th century English literature professor who took an interest in me, who was kind in a not very kind environment, and reached out to me, and so I admired him as a person. He sort of mentored me, and so that probably is the biggest answer. But I really, in addition to that, I love satire. I love the moral didacticism of someone like Defoe and the brilliance of someone like Swift. And so that century is so pivotal in our own, in our own moment, in terms of like the modern era reaching what it is, that there's so much that interests me. But then there was that personal connection with a professor that I admired and invested in me.
That's really interesting. And you're a Christian, a very
Yes.
well-known Christian. So the intersection that I see between Christianity and intellectualism sometimes can be a dangerous intersection, we'll call it. So just for the record, I was once a Southern Baptist, and one of the reasons why I left that denomination in the 90s was because of its propensity for anti-intellectualism, at least where I saw it. So before your recent skirmishes with leadership in the SBC, how did you manage to navigate your way through the convention all those years?
Whew, wow. I'm glad this is a storytelling podcast. So, I think I need to even kind of go back a little bit. Like, how did I end up in the Southern Baptist Convention? Because that's part of the story as well. I grew up in the Northeast, which is liberal and secular and often hostile to Christians. And so I was accustomed kind of being the only Christian among my friends, among my classmates, and so forth. Very different cultural climate, and I grew up in Baptistic churches. So they weren't Southern Baptists. We didn't have a lot of Southern Baptist churches in the Northeast. I think they've colonized since then, but so just Baptistic in ecclesiology and doctrine. And then when I finished my PhD and moved to Virginia, where I am now, and I took a job at Liberty University, the world's one of the largest evangelical universities. That was in the late 90s, and of course the conservative resurgence that happened in the Southern Baptist Convention, and growing up in the Northeast and going to smaller independent Baptist churches, I did receive the caution up against prevailing liberalism and questioning the authority of the word and God and all of those things. And so when we moved to the South, I understood that the Southern Baptist Convention was not going to, that they were standing firm on biblical authority and hermeneutics and interpretation. And so we just kind of immediately looked for a Southern Baptist church on the basis of what I believed that its stand was really on biblical authority. That was, this is 25 years ago. And we were moving from the north to the south. It was a real culture shock. I had no idea that, how shall I put this? I had no idea that the resentment over the Civil War was still alive and well in the South. I mean, we just didn't think about the Civil War in the Northeast, which I guess, again, makes sense. I guess the winners write the history. And I don't mean that. I don't mean that. I just mean, I just did not understand. So we moved to the South. I had no idea that I never got over the culture shock, even of just the idea, because in the Northeast, you didn't go to church unless you were like a hardcore Christian. Like you could lead someone to the Lord and they might have this new faith, but getting them to church was a huge battle because that just required so much in that context. Down here, it was the reverse. Everyone goes to church, but whether or not they're actually a believer, they don't even really know because it's just been so is part of the culture. So all of that to say, I had no idea what I was getting into in terms of the change in the culture, did not know the history of the Southern Baptist Convention. And I don't mean I obviously I knew that it was formed in the over slavery, but I just thought that I thought everyone had changed their mind about those things. um, and I did not know the history of the conservative resurgence being rooted in, power plays and sexual abusers and misogynists and all of those things. So that's how I got there, and how I navigated it, to answer your question, is I can be very slow. It took me this 25 years to kind of understand what was happening. And so I went in good faith, had good experiences, and was, tapped for this role and that role and this leadership role, and just kind of went along thinking, well, whatever is, I could obviously begin to see the past and see the present, the negative aspects of it, and just thought that I could be a force for change. Nobody's perfect. No institution is perfect. No people are perfect. No church is perfect. I'm not looking for perfection. My bar is pretty low, actually. And just thought that that there were enough good people in it who wanted to see a better future. And there are good people who do, but not enough, and not enough for me to make a change. So it just took me a long time to see that.
All right, so following up on that, so do names like Karen Swallow Prior, Beth Moore, and Russell Moore keep Southwest or Southern Baptist officials awake at night?
I don't think so. I really don't. I think that the money and the institutions and the traditions and the networks are so powerful that they continue to prevail. And so we just, we're, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about books now. So
Okay.
you've written several books on literature, reading, and theology. So which of your books has had the
Hmm.
most long-lasting effect on you?
Oh, no one's ever asked me that question before. That's a good one. Um, so I mean, the one that reflects the most long lasting impact, I think that reflects most of my life, is my first one, Booked Literature and the Soul of Me, which is just, it's really a memoir of how books taught me spiritual lessons that I didn't learn in church, and how it took me a long time to understand how my love for books and my love for God go together. I thought they were at odds with one another, but they aren't at all. And so that one is probably the most meaningful one for me personally, sort of, and in my soul, as the title reflects. But another way that I'm kind of having a book is having an effect on me is really my most recent one, The Evangelical Imagination. Um, Stories, images, and metaphors created a culture in crisis, because that is really the beginning, sort of the beginning of the story I just shared about me becoming awakened to the problems in the Southern Baptist Convention and evangelicalism after having been part of it for decades. So that was me processing things I was seeing other people go through, and through teaching, reading, and and being in those institutions. But it was also something I was going through myself. And so I think that book is probably the one that right now is still sort of having its effect on me, and that I'm still processing in terms of the things that I write about in it.
Okay. And regarding that book, again, it's called The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Create a Culture in Crisis. So I'm curious, if that work was influenced by Francis Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live?
Hmm. So I was heavily influenced by Francis Schaeffer. Going back into the 80s and 90s, I was very much committed to Christian worldview as he taught it, and as he influenced conservative evangelicals. And so this, so in a sense it is, but this book is also me sort of expressing my understanding that Christian worldview is more of a it is an intellectual, cerebral, conscious, cognitive approach to the faith, which I love, because I love that stuff. But after having taught using that sort of Christian worldview approach for decades, and living by that myself, I realized that that's not enough. Again, that there are underlying precognitive metaphors, stories, images that drive us, expectations that drive us that we're not thinking about, that we're not applying. So I would say that the evangelical imagination is me sort of interrogating the strength and limitations of the framework of Christian worldview. I still think it's great. That's how I pretty much operate. But I'm understanding, after having read a lot of James K.A. Smith, that we are desiring creatures before we are thinking creatures, as he says it. And that we are more than heads on sticks, and that we are absorbed into the stories and metaphors and images of our communities and our cultures, and we just might not even, we're not even aware of it, and yet they're shaping us, and moving us, and creating our desires in ways we don't recognize until we sort of stop and try to uncover them.
Okay, I do want to ask a couple more questions about that book. But before I do, in preparing for this interview, I was thinking, sort of making my own personal connections to this topic. And one of the books that came to mind is sitting on my bookshelf that I read quite a while ago, Habits of the Mind. I don't know if you've ever read that. James W. Sire. And the
Oh, I
subtitle
have
is
not. Mhm.
Intellectual Life as a Christian Calling. I would highly recommend this one.
Okay. I have a couple of his books, but not that one. I'm not even familiar with that one. I'm going to look it up. The title sounds exactly like what I'm talking about.
Yes, exactly. So, how does, um, first of all, the evangelical imagination, how does that relate to a deeper understanding of the Bible?
Hmm. That is a great question, because obviously the Bible is, it is a story, right? It's a grand story. It tells the story. It's God's story, but it also tells the story of peoples and communities and different cultures, from the Hebrews to the Jews to the early Christians, and I think it actually demonstrates for us how powerful our own communities, metaphors and stories and habits and ways of thinking and living are. And this is one of the things that can be an obstacle for people in really reading and understanding the Bible well, is that they don't understand that the Bible is often describing, not prescribing, right? It's often prescribing, like when we get the 10 Commandments, those are laws. Like, we are clearly supposed to follow those. But there are different genres in the Bible. When the Bible tells a history of a people, and a person, and their sin, and their falling, and their triumphs, and all of those things, those are stories. They're true stories, but they aren't prescriptive, other than the principles that we can draw from them, or the laws that are laid down for us. And so, understanding that they are stories. This is, there was an interesting little dust up on Twitter recently, where a famous pastor, late pastor Tim Keller, had said something about, the people don't realize they're sinners because you tell them that. That was what he said. And people were contesting that. And someone said, no, the sacrifice of the lamb and the sacrifice of Christ does tell them that they are sinners. And it was like, that person didn't even understand that what he was saying is exactly what Keller was saying. Because no one was saying the words, you're a sinner, in those examples. Like, the sacrifice of the lamb, like, is a demonstration. It's showing, it's teaching something in an immersive and material way. Obviously there are words that go along with it, but it's the act, it's not the words, that communicate that element of the gospel, that we are sinners. And so the Bible is filled with symbols and stories and images and practices that teach us the truths that God wants us to know about him, along with the words. I'm very much a word person, but it's more than just the words. It's those things too, and we have them in our own cultures and our own churches and communities today.
And one of the challenges I found is in the what people would call the literal interpretation, not realizing that different words mean different things in different contexts. So it literally means how it's intended by the writer at the time it's
Hmm.
spoken
Hmm.
by the speaker in that context. So you talk about images and metaphors. How do you think that has created the culture in crisis, and what do you mean by a culture in
Hmm.
crisis?
Hmm. Well, yeah. What do I mean? So when I'm talking about a culture in crisis in terms of the book, I'm because I'm an evangelical and I'm looking at the evangelical history that goes back about 300 years to the evangelical revival in the early 18th century. Again, my period. Um, you know, I'm seeing that 300 years later, things we have reached a crisis, and I it the crisis is that people, first of all, don't even know what evangelicalism means. Or they think that it means what the headline writers say, and they reject it or contest it or don't like it anymore, or they co-opted it. In fact, I saw someone say, for example, that the first principle of evangelicals is to be pro-life. Well, I'm pro-life, and I think the Bible teaches us to be pro-life, but the evangelical movement had nothing to do with that until fairly recently. 300 years ago, they weren't even thinking about that. So we don't know our history. That's part of the crisis. We're seeing the fruit of the crisis of evangelicalism being married to American politics of the 21st century, which is very small and narrow when you consider a longer history, not only of evangelicalism, but the world and the church and around the globe. And so evangelicalism has reached this crisis point where we don't know who we are, we don't know what the word means. And maybe the words meanings do change. I hate that that's true, but it is. And so maybe the meaning is changing and we're living through that. But that's the crisis. Who are we? Just as even just as evangelicals, a 300-year-old movement that is around the globe now, who are we? What does the word mean? Where are we going to go from here? I think only history will tell us, because we're in this moment right now and we haven't seen the end of the history written yet.
Okay, so let's switch to another one of your books, Fierce Convictions, The
Hmm.
Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, poet, reformer, and abolitionist. And your forward for that book was written by Eric Metaxas. He's famous for his acclaimed bio on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who happens to be one of my personal heroes. And he's Mr. Metaxas is now a very vocal Trump apologist. So, have you been able to remain on good terms with him over the years?
Hmm. Whew. No, no. Unfortunately, no. And but I think that's a story that many of us share. We're living in our own, we are seeing relationships severed and divided. I did try to maintain a relationship for a while, along with some others, and sort of to do an intervention and see what was happening there. But I don't know what happened. I don't know why that wasn't possible. But again, I think he's sort of an example writ large of what many of us, I think probably all of us, are seeing happening to at least to some members of our family and friends, who, and again, I'm a person who, I can tolerate a wide range of disagreements. I can, my sort of uh, strength and weakness is that I can see all the perspectives of just about any issue, and so that's a good thing, it's a bad thing, and so I can be very empathetic and imaginative and understanding. But I really do have difficulty, and I do understand why many conservative evangelicals chose the calculus that had them vote for Trump. I understand that, but the full-throated embrace and sort of promotion of him as a King Cyrus, or our next savior, that I do not understand. Part of the evangelical imagination was me trying to understand how did we get to this place, but I can't say that I do. But it's fierce conviction. You asked the question about fierce conviction. That's based on my doctoral dissertation that I did on Hannah More. It's different, but it's for a popular audience. But that's where I discovered my roots as an evangelical, because it was Hannah More and Wilberforce, her best buddy William Wilberforce, and other evangelicals of their time in the middle to later 18th century, who they were evangelicals. They embraced that identity. They helped form what it means to be an evangelical, and they were abolitionists. They were social reformers. Hannah More helped people to read from the lower classes to the high. She wrote treatises and tracts for every class of people. She was a literary artist. She bridged many different divides, and so she was just an inspiring figure among many of that time who were evangelical, and that's the heritage that I wanted to reclaim and wanted to embrace. But again, the crisis now is, I think, we may be at a turning point and at a break from the past. That's what happens throughout history, and we may be there now.
Okay. One thing I learned while preparing for this interview that I had never realized before, Hannah More and William Wilberforce, I also have a bio of him here on my bookshelf, how they were sort of the foundation for the animal rights movement.
Yes, a lot of evangelicals don't know that. Now, they would not have used the term rights. They would use care or welfare. But Wilberforce was one of the founders of what was then the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. I think maybe the Royal came later. But yes, they had a widespread sort of holistic, integrated view of what it means to be a benevolent person, a person of goodwill toward all others, and to try to eliminate needless harm and suffering for everyone, whether it was a child laborer or an enslaved person or an animal or women or men. And so this was just one issue across a whole range that they saw as part of sort of one seamless cloth of what it meant to be a Christian trying to integrate biblical principles into the entire world around them. And so, yes, that's part of our heritage as evangelicals as well.
Yeah, for my listeners who aren't familiar with the name Wilberforce, um, and he was British, and he was the inspiration behind ending the slave trade in Britain, and an inspiration to later on to the United States for the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. So,
Mhm.
just want to encourage you to learn about him if you don't already know about him. So, let's go on to the next question. You talk a lot about nuance in your public speaking engagements. So, how do you measure nuance in language, and where does it cross a line into compromise?
Hmm. Yeah, that is a very good question. So I think that there are clearly principles, commandments, laws from the Bible, that tell us what is right, what is wrong, what we can tolerate within the church, and what we can't. And yet we are messy human beings living in changing cultures and times, and we are also creatures who use language and words that again change meaning, we speak different languages. I don't know how many languages there are in the world right now, but even the Bible is not written in our own language that we are speaking, not originally. And so almost all of our life is a translation, right? It's a translation. If you read it, a translation of a literary work, is written in one language and you read it in your own language. And if you happen to know both languages, you know that there are different ways to translate that. And so if I have a conviction, say about marriage, or conviction about abortion, which I do have those convictions, and I'm speaking with someone who is expressing their view, I cannot know even where we agree or disagree unless we have a conversation about the words that they are using. They may be using a word in a way that I wouldn't use, or they may be using a phrase that I wouldn't use, but they mean something different by it. And so the fact that we are people who use language, and our own language has layers of meanings, and the fact that we are people who we are a race who has many different languages that we have to translate to communicate with one another, we really have to just even get down to the level of words, and making sure we understand the same thing by the words that we're using, uh, before we can know whether we agree or disagree. So just that's sort of just a given for me. Obviously, many of us are going to disagree with one another about very important issues. And there are some issues that can't be nuanced very much, but so much of our animosity and our antagonism and our misunderstanding, if it's not rooted in ill will, and sometimes it is, if it's not rooted in ill will, can often just be rooted in the fact that we're using different words to mean the same thing, or the same words and meaning different things. So that's a requirement for nuance in itself.
Okay, so on the opposite end of nuance, I would say would be black and white thinking. So
Mhm.
is there any real risk to that type of certainty in one's perspective?
I think there are a lot of risks. I mean, I think there are a couple of things maybe most of us should and could stake our lives on and stake our eternal destiny on. Um, but and we have within the church, we have creeds, and we can agree that we believe in these creeds or that we don't, and we can agree that we believe in the words of the Bible or don't. But beyond that, there is all we can do as human beings, and we should do it, is to honestly attempt our best understanding, not in isolation, but our best understanding within the best community that we can find, the most trustworthy community that we can find. And again, I'm speaking as a Christian, but even if you're not a religious person, you have to do the same thing in your own intellectual or academic communities, and to try to strive for the best understanding, with the humility that that's what it is, that it is my best understanding, and other people might have a different best understanding, but we are just simply obligated um, to live by our own best understanding, and to keep seeking to better that best understanding.
Okay, so a little bit out of left field on the follow up. So are the Lord of the Rings readers the lords of failed nuance?
Oh, yes. So this has been a topic of discussion of late. It it does seem so. And well, although I would say, again, I do want to put it out there, I'm not a big Lord of the Rings fan or Tolkien fan. I actually dislike fantasy for the reasons that we're talking about. Actually, that fantasy tends to uh, lack nuance. Now, some out there I'm sure does, but it traffics in ideals and black and whites. I mean, even Star Wars is a romance. It's like, you got the black suited people and the white suit. I have spent a long, the white suited people. Cowboy westerns are, black hat, white hat. I mean, things are in black and white in romances and fantasy, generally speaking. And then when you take the Lord of the Rings, the people who love the books tell me that, the books are much more complicated and nuanced than the films. So if people are just really trafficking in the films and the memes, I think that they are lacking in nuance. But I would say the same thing about Jane Austen, whom I adore, that people who watch the movies and have not read the books have a complete misunderstanding of what the books are about, because the books are not romances, but the movies are.
Okay. So could it discourage young people from doing the kind of reading that you want to see if they worry that their motives might be interpreted incorrectly?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't yeah, I'm not sure that people, that they think about their motives so much. I mean, I actually would hope and that anyone who is attracted to the story or the film would go and read it. I think that's probably happening. And so I think the real problem that we have is not the stories themselves, whether they're in film or text. It's the social media context that is driving the polarization and the siloization of thinking. And social media gives a lot of gifts. Don't get me wrong. Here we are, right? We've connected
Hmm.
through social media. It has great power for good, but I think it also is the driving force in the lack of nuance. It's pushing people to one side or the other, to one group or another, to one fan culture or another, one team or another. And that's the thing that we really have to guard against, I think, in this moment.
Okay. So one of your jobs is that you're a professor. So what do you think makes a good teacher?
Oh. I do love teaching. I am now have moved into full-time writing and speaking, but I do teach, at an adjunct level here and there. I think first of all, I do agree with what the Bible says about teaching. I believe teaching is a gift and you have it or you don't, and then you can cultivate it. We are given gifts, and some people should not be teachers, just as I should not be a nurse. And many other things. So, if one has the gift of teaching, what makes one a good teacher is loving the subject that you're teaching, loving the ones that you're teaching, and of course loving God and putting them all together. And so loving what you teach requires learning about it, and you don't you could there are different ways of learning. I mean, I have a PhD, but a second grade teacher who just has a college degree can love the subject in a different way. So you need to know the subject, but you also need to know the students, listen to them, know where they are. My philosophy of teaching has always been meet students where they are and take them where they should be. And so it's listening, knowing if I'm teaching graduate students in seminary, they're at a different place. I meet them where they are and take them somewhere else. If I'm teaching freshmen who barely passed English in high school, I meet them where they are and take them where they could or should be. And so it's getting ourselves out of the way and letting the subject matter, as we love that, help the students grow in that area, because every subject matter can, it's not just the subject. My whole point when I was teaching, I would tell my students, whether they were English majors or just taking the class because it was required, I would say, my goal for you is that you walk out of this classroom at the end of the semester loving literature, life, and God more than when you came in.
That seems like a pretty good goal. So, how do you generate an interest to read higher literature? And then, what can a reader hope to gain after they begin doing so?
So, reading is a skill that we learn in first grade, if not before. We can all kind of decode the letters. I mean, unless we have a disability or a problem, but we can decode the letters, look up the words in the dictionary. If we don't know what they mean, sound them out. We can do all that from the age of a small child. And so everything after that is just increasing and improving the skill. It's hard. I find the biggest obstacle to reading well is people's misunderstanding that if it's hard, they can't do it well. But all you have to do is slow down. One of the things that I do in classes a lot is just open up a book and read it together, whether it's a sentence or a paragraph, and slow down and look at the words, look at the syntax, look at listen to the sound if it's a poem. Just slow down and see what's happening there. But we live in a world that's most of what we read, we just read quickly, we skim it because we should read it quickly, we should skim it. But when it comes to rich literary texts that are works of art, we've lost the muscles to read closely and carefully, and it just takes a matter of will and practice. And so slow down, let yourself grapple with the sentence. If you don't know what the word means, look it up. If the sentence doesn't make sense, read it 3 times. Most of us aren't willing to do that because we don't have time. I get that. But also many don't know that's just what we're supposed to do. That's, it's just like any other, I'm not good with the sports metaphors. But, if you're a basketball player, like your most foundational skill is, I think, dribbling, right? But you have to practice that basic skill over and over and over to get good at it, right? I mean, so reading is a similar thing. The more you do practice the basic skill, you can get better and better and better at it. And so I think of reading in that way as kind of like dribbling, just like stop, look at the word, look at, the sentence, see how it's put together, make sure you understand it before you move on.
Okay. So, do you get philosophical about literature?
I do, because I think that, I mean, I love art, visual art, paintings. I love film. I love music. I don't know much about music. I enjoy it. Um, but literature is a different kind of art. Literature is the use of language. And I think that as human beings, we're made in the image of God, who is, one of his names is Word. He is the Word, and he communicates to us through words. So I think that there's just something especially powerful and significant and unique about the way that we as human beings respond to and interact with language, and whether it's spoken or written. Words are symbols, so that means that they are, they're indirect. We have to interpret them. And so the very fact that we have to interpret them, as opposed to just, if I see a painting, I'm looking at it and there's some interpretive work that I can do, but it's a different kind. The fact that we have to interpret words, interpret their meaning, taps into the fact that we are creatures who desire and need meaning. We are interpretive creatures. So if we interpret a literary text, we're practicing the same thing we're doing all day long when we're interpreting a facial expression, interpreting a traffic problem, interpreting is what we do all day long. And so literature just reminds us and helps us to practice that interpretive nature that we have as human beings.
Okay. So let's lighten it up a little bit as we start to wind down the interview. So I'm curious, what makes you laugh?
The Office, the show.
Yes.
I watch it over and over, so it just makes me laugh a lot. I think it's so funny. I would love to be like, I've never wanted to, like, I just wish I could be a fly in the wall in the writer's room in that show, because it's so well written. So that makes me laugh a lot. My husband makes me laugh. Most of the time he's like, there's a lot of dad jokes going on there, but he's not even a dad. But my dogs make me laugh. Jonathan Swift really makes me laugh.
Okay. Wow. That's a wide range. The Office and Jonathan Swift.
Yes. And they're both satire, so.
Yes. And I guess your husband's somewhere in between. We'll say he's closer to the Jonathan Swift side than the Office.
Well,
it depends on the day, probably. Okay, I just have one question left for you. So I'm curious, what's on the near horizon for Dr. Pryor?
Well, this past summer, I turned in my next book manuscript. So in July of 2025, my newest book will be coming out, which is called You Have a Calling. And it's about finding your calling and your vocation, which I argue, which is messy for a lot of people. We have a lot of different views about what this means, and I try to, clarify them and show that we're all called to pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful. And if we do that, we'll find our true calling.
I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm definitely looking forward to that. That sounds really
good.
So I'd like to have you back next summer when your book is released and we can talk about it then.
Absolutely. I'll make sure you get a copy, advance copy, and we'll come on and talk about that. That would be lovely.
That sounds great. All right. My guest this week has been Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. Karen, thank you so much for being here and sharing your stories again. I appreciate your time. I know you've been very busy. It's been a real pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
So if you're new here, please subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. And also please share it with a friend. I'd greatly appreciate it. That's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.